Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for us. Maybe that'll inspire Apple to promote us a little in the new year. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSPod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, it was crappy birthday to me. One of the single worst birthdays I've had ever, including the ones my old man forgot. Not that I hold it against him too much. But I got to spend the day, let's see. My birthday was last Thursday, so I had 2 days, Wednesday and Thursday, of FDA meetings. Wednesdays was okay. Thursdays turned out to be one of those, they really just wanted to check the box off and say they'd met with industry, and it didn't really feel like they wanted to hear anything we had to say. Problem was, it meant I had to stay over for my birthday, woke up in a crappy hotel room at 5 a.m. because I don't sleep well in hotels, had shitty coffee, boring train ride back home, and then got hit with a stomach bug the day after my birthday from 4:30 to 4:30 in the morning, and really just not a great celebration for me all around. That said, I did come home to, some nice gifts from my wife who, puts up with all this stuff, and a couple of neat books from pals of mine who managed to remember the birthday. I also got to celebrate by stealing something that Clive James used in Cultural Amnesia, my favorite collection of essays outside of Montaigne. He cited Egon Friedel, the great Austrian Jew intellectual who killed himself in 1938, but this is before that, who used to handed out cards on his 50th birthday saying something to the effect of all the birthday wishes I received today, yours is the one that delighted me most. I used that for every single Facebook and text and email wishing me a happy birthday. So eventually no one got the Friedel part of it, but they did get the Gil being a snarky wise-ass part, which is pretty much all I have to live for. Anyway, otherwise I'm looking forward to a better 47th year than the 47th celebration. But to the podcast. Our guest this week is the artist Seymour Chwast. And I just use artist because any other term I throw out there for this guy is going to be way too restrictive. Because you could call him an illustrator, designer, typographer, woodcut maker, graphic novelist, metal sculptor, poster maker, printer. It goes on and on. You get the idea. Seymour has had this legendary career. I think, and it's the start of our conversation, multiple legendary careers, stretching on for almost 70 years now. He's a contemporary of a couple of guys I recorded with last year, R.O. Bleckman, George Lois, even Arnie Levin. They connected either through the advertising world or they worked directly at Pushpin Studios, which Seymour was one of the founders of, along with Ed Sorel and Milton Glaser. He belongs to this world that I can't even imagine an analogy for nowadays. He's had this amazing creative career with a big social impact, and he's just kept going and going and going. And he's not living in abject poverty, as many of the artists I know younger artists I know tend to. So it's that combination of being able to have a career, but also being able to make a living at this, that I just don't know if it exists the same way nowadays. And that's why I love sitting down with guys like Seymour and R.O. and George and finding out what it was like having a whole career where you could be creative like this. That said, of all the guys I just mentioned, Seymour, I think, is the least interested in looking back at his career or thinking about posterity and his place in creative history. It becomes a point of humor during the conversation because I was not expecting that at all. I thought there'd be some degree of wanting to look back and kind of gather up the body of his work, but it's really not there. I am inclined to think, as we also joked, that might be a key to staying productive in one's mid-80s, not looking back and not trying to put yourself in some sort of pantheon. I'll leave you guys to decide that. And after the conversation with Seymour, we've got a special appearance by the very first person ever to appear on this podcast as a guest. Now, here's Seymour's bio from his Amazon page. There's a much more extensive bio at pushpininc.com, as well as the one at seymourchwastarchive.com. I'll include the show notes for the Pushpin one. I'll include the bio from the Pushpin one in the show notes for the episode. But you'll find both of his websites you can go to and find a whole lot more about Seymour and his work. Seymour Chwast is co-founder of Pushpin Studios and has been director of the Pushpin Group, where he reintroduced graphic styles and transformed them into a contemporary vocabulary. His designs and illustrations have been used in advertising, animated films, and editorial, corporate, and environmental graphics. He has created over 100 posters, illustrated more than 30 children's books, drawn a series of graphic novels, and invented several typefaces. His work has been the subject of 3 monographs. Many museums have collected his posters, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Library of Congress, and the Israel Museum. He has lectured and exhibited worldwide and is in the Art Directors Hall of Fame. He is a recipient of the 1985 medal from the American Institute of Graphic Artists. Chwast lives in New York City with his wife, the graphic designer and painter Paula Scher. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Seymour Chwast. You've had multiple major retrospectives of your career, big collections of your body of work over the years. I guess my question to begin with is, what is that idea of you were legendary back when you were in your 40s and 50s, and you've surpassed and outlasted legendary status. What does that entail? What is it like looking back at your career, I suppose? Do you see things as a continuous arc? Do you see what you've done as a sort of continuum? Or is it always these slices and increments of work that's directly in front of you?
Well, I sort of thought I was part of the mainstream when I started out, sort of interested in particular styles of illustration that were prevalent, as well as poster design. Lately, though, it's a little sort of, I tend to do things in a similar way because that's the way my hand goes. I try to take things out of the box and sort of broaden the kind of work that I'd like to have done and shown.
And what was that evolution like, I guess, as the poster became less prominent, commercially or within the culture? Your response to that, finding other forms to work in.
Yeah, posters are great. I still love doing them. They're big, and they end up in some museum collections, which I like. But I also like to illustrate. I love doing books. And I'm still happy that there's some print still being done, although it's an endangered species.
Can you talk about how you approach, a children's book versus the graphic novel adaptations you've done, and then how the approach for each of those kind of differs from the illustration work in general?
Yeah, I can't write So I'm sort of limited in what I can do in books. I've done children's books that have working with writers. A few of them have been more conceptual, so I've been able to handle both the writing and the illustrating as well as the design. I always put the books together. For my 4 graphic novels, because I can't write, I took the text from the classics and I adapted it. So I had a free hand in working with the material, trying to be faithful to it, but adding my own visual interest.
Adaptation is still a form of writing. I mean, editing and recontextualizing what you did there with the Odyssey, etc. But where did the interest in the classics begin for you? The classic literature, I mean. Where did that start for you?
Where it started?
Yeah.
It started when I was looking around for some material that people might know which would allow me to interest a publisher in doing a book.
There wasn't a sense of, wanting to do either an original work or a contemporary adaptation?
Well, I would have been happy. I'd be happy to work with a contemporary writer, somebody who's living. Of course, I don't have to share the royalties with anybody.
True.
Working with the classics.
I guess this was. Well, it's an awful question to jump into so early, but can you talk about how the business has changed? It's been 6 decades of illustration, design, etc.
Yeah, the business has changed partly because of use of computers and with other technological advances. And that probably is the major reason, which means that there are fewer editorial illustrations being seen these days, although there are wonderful illustrators out there doing terrific work.
A number of whom are very happy that I'm speaking with you today. I hit up a bunch of like John Cuneo and Joe Ciardello and guys like that. Like, oh my God, you're going to get to see Seymour. So you're held in high regard. But really, it's that,
John emailed me this morning.
Watch out for this guy.
Watch out, right?
Okay. But as far as changes in business goes, it really is both the technology and the distribution.
Yeah, and because it's apparent that things are easy in terms of illustration. With the use of computers, it makes their work easier, and I guess editors and publishers have found that out, which means that they've lowered their fees. That is a big thing. Illustration now used to be able to make a fair living now. Now it's pretty rough.
Yeah.
Working with illustration.
Do you teach or have you taught?
I've taught, yes.
Do you have any conception of what you would do if you were young and starting out at this point?
I have no idea.
Yeah. I sort of assumed, but you would go find some other.
Well, when people ask me that, I said I would like to have had a candy store, but I also like the idea of printing. I would have loved to have a shop where I made books and signs and do everything with letterpress, and be able to print my own woodcuts, which I love to do.
Yeah, how did you discover that form, the woodcut? Should we say form or technique? I don't know.
Yeah,
how to
it's a
describe
technique.
It. Yeah.
Well, when I used to look around when I was a kid, I got interested in some of the artists who worked that way. Mm-hmm. The German Expressionists, for one. Antonio Frasconi was a teacher of mine, great at woodcuts. And I found out it wasn't difficult to do it. Doing etchings is rough for me. is too much preparation.
Yeah.
Is better satisfaction in doing woodcuts, immediate satisfaction, because as soon as you cut it, you can make a print, and that's it.
Favorite technique, favorite form that you work in, or is it really just dependent on what you're trying to do?
I do woodcuts when it's appropriate, or when somebody asks me to do it on assignment.
In the introduction to a big collection of your work, your wife refers to the big idea as the convenient excuse Seymour uses to force himself to make another drawing. That idea of, well, again, when I sat down with George Lois and it was all the big idea and the idea of the concept, how significant are those notions for you going into a personal one and a commercial piece of work? And how do those things differ? That's a whole bunch of varied questions. I guess the big question is, how do you balance art and commerce?
Oh, well, I always considered myself a commercial artist.
Yeah.
People get in touch with me. They need a design or a drawing, and I do it. I do it for a fee. And that's the way it started out. And that's still the way to do it. But I've also generated my own work, either on weekends doing papier-mâché sculpture, and now it's acrylic on canvas. Also, I worked with metal, and also coming up with book ideas, as well as occasionally doing a drawing that might work in one of the magazines that I've worked for.
Mm-hmm. And staying creative? In terms of is that the stuff that recharges you in terms of?
Well, coming up with a good idea is great. I mean, it's, better than sex. Terrific coming up with a concept that really works. Either solving a problem that I have to solve or coming up with an idea that I can develop into something, like a book.
Mm-hmm. Do you do much work designing for digital, for the screen, as opposed to print and physical objects? I mean, your website's kind of interestingly done. It doesn't look like an afterthought, but do you do any real work in terms of digital design?
How do you mean?
Designing things for a screen, for
the screen?
Online. Yeah.
No, I've done a few websites and knowing and work that I know will appear on the screen.
Yeah, but things that are made expressly for the screen as opposed to, a poster that's scanned and shown. Yeah,
I've done work, especially for the screen, although I try to ignore the difference with the requirements and do what I want to do.
That's what I was wondering. Is there are there constraints, I guess?
No, not as much as while working for a magazine, knowing what that magazine is, and it affects the way I approach the assignment. I always consider the place where my work will appear. And with illustration, unfortunately, I can't place it. I can't do anything with the drawing. I work to the size that they give me. There's still enough freedom in the box that I have to work with for me to spend my talent and emotion into making something really good.
Were you one of those drawing as a kid and you just never stopped?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
I'm assuming that's
Mm-hmm.
Who were the visual influences as a kid? I know you'd mentioned comics and cartoons in the past. Mm-hmm. Were there particular ones that were?
Well, it was seeing Snow White that set me on my way to wanting to be an animator and going into the movies and doing animation. Pinocchio was another film like that, and I assumed that's the way I was going to do when I grew up.
Have you grown up? I mean,
I try not to.
I don't mean in a bad way, but there does seem to be a childlike thing going on. But
sure,
just
of course,
in terms of staying curious. But
well, maybe that's because of the lack of talent.
You think that about yourself?
Yeah, the things that I can't do.
Like,
yeah, I can't do caricatures like Barry Blitt and Ed Sorel. And there are other techniques that I just can't handle.
but on balance, you seem less neurotic than either of them. So, I'm just.
You can leave that in.
Oh yeah, no, trust me. I'm as long as I say it, not you. It's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But what has become easier? I guess.
I'm sorry?
What has become easier, and what's tougher, as far as the art itself goes? Not in terms of selling what you do. Over the years, I know it's a long-term career, but what are things you look back and say, I could never have done this when I was, 30, 40 years old?
Yeah, I look at some old work, drawings with line work, with Celotac, with overlays for color. I'm amazed that I had done it. The things that I could never do anymore. Mm-hmm. For elaborate work, with some technique that I no longer use.
Things that are technologically obsolete, or just you don't need that anymore to get the effect you want?
Well, I might need it, but if I can't do it,
yeah, that's what I wondered. If it's,
then I do what I can do.
And are there things that are easier? Things that, I don't want to say tricks, but things.
No, the only thing that's easier is knowing the approach to everything. What do I have to do? But what's harder is coming up with ideas. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I was starting out and sort of looked at work at Saul Sundberg, I figured, hey, he's done everything. There's nothing left for me to do, which made it very difficult for me to look at his work. I had to avoid it for many years because it was so depressing knowing that there was nothing left for me, no other ideas that could be done. Mm-hmm. But now it's struggling to get good ideas.
How did you get over that? I think Harold Bloom calls it the anxiety of influence, that fear that the great figure above you has already surpassed you and you're not going to come up with anything.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember when you started to think you actually knew what you were doing, or that you had something to contribute?
Oh, I don't know. It's too
vague. Continuum. Okay, that's because I still haven't gotten over that myself. So
yeah, no. I always sort of got into it. I really have never reflected on my work that much. Mm-hmm. I had a job to do, and I did it. I looked around sometimes. When I saw something I had done that maybe I should work on a little bit harder. But that's all that it is. It's, and working and trying to accomplish something that would make at least my clients happy.
Yeah. How's New York changed for you?
Changed?
Yeah. You've been here quite a while. And I know you've got the place in Connecticut also, but...
Yeah, no, I was born in the Bronx and lived in Brooklyn. Brooklyn has changed.
Yeah.
Brooklyn was a place that was great to get away from. Now there are too many people who can't afford to live there. That's where my grandparents lived. New York has changed.
And I mean your New York. Yeah.
My New York.
Yeah.
Well, it's changed. Well, Interesting question.
I try.
Yeah, what's changed is the design of cars. I look at cars a lot.
Yeah.
My favorite decade was the 30s. The 30s cars were really terrific. They were very organic, or they're very luxurious looking. They all made a statement. Now I look for differences in cars, and it's sort of hard to find them. Yeah, either the shape of the grille in the front or the way they do the windows on the side might be different. So I look for those things. Yeah. But New York, Things are become easier for me here because I live in an area where everything is convenient.
I noticed you had the two barbecue joints across the street from each other and a museum of sex right across the corner. So, I figured you got material.
Everything is easy. The subways are nearby. Everything the post office, not so bad. It's okay.
For people who actually mail something nowadays.
Right.
We try and cut that down as much as we can. But and how important is having the place outside the city?
Yeah, I've always had to have a place.
Yeah.
Outside on weekends to get away. I mean, the suburbs in the middle are no interest in that. It seems to be the worst way to live. But to be able to be inside, right in the middle, in the city, and then being able to get away from it on weekends, it's great.
You talk about Jewishness.
Jewishness?
Yeah, not practicing Judaism, but what being a Jew means. As a fellow Jew, by the way, I should mention. Because some people don't get it, but yeah. Is there anything culturally or identity-oriented that it means for you?
No, I try to avoid that. I mean, I do identify myself as a Jew. I'm sort of interested in Jews who have accomplished things. But otherwise, there's absolutely avoided all rituals. I was never bar mitzvahed. My father was an atheist, and I learned atheism as well. Yeah. And that's what I practice.
Nice. And pacifism?
As well, pacifism, of course.
Yeah, can you talk about the what that has meant to you, and sort of where that began for you? That
pacifism, I have no idea.
I know it seems critical to your work, and the things you've done. I just didn't know if there was an origin point for it, or just a growing up 30s into the 40s.
Yeah, well, when I was growing up, it was around. More than being a liberal, having interest in being a pacifist and being against war generally. I don't know where that came from, although I had a cousin who was an author and a poet. She was an anarchist, but I learned a lot about me while observing what her interests were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, were you drafted around the war?
I'm sorry?
You didn't serve?
No.
Okay. I was trying to remember from your age in Korean War if you would have been of age, but okay. Only because pretty much every guest I have had who was of age for Korea, Pfeiffer, Bruce Friedman, etc., every one of them has stories about doing anything they could to get out of the Army once they were in.
I have my story as well.
Dish, please. If it's something you can tell without getting arrested, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, the Korean War was going on, and I shared a studio with a dancer. This guy, he was gay, and he told me there was a technique in avoiding the draft, which is to wear a white shirt with the collars curled up, turning the collar like that.
Was that a signifier to the draft?
I have no idea. Well, it seemed to have worked, so I can't complain about it. But but when I went down to the draft board, I was amazed that the kids were so gung ho, and they were ready to go into the Korean War, which was as stupid as any of them could be. But they asked about homosexuality, and I said I used to observe it. so they threw me out.
Reminds me, there was a movie called Stripes back in the early 80s with Bill Murray and Harold Ramis. And, you're homosexual? No, but I'm willing to learn. so good. That kept you out. That's good. Without tooting your own horn, or feel free to toot your own horn, can you talk about the impact of Pushpin and the origins of it? I'm sure you've gone through the story about connecting with Milton Glaser and Ed Sorel, but can you talk about the impact it's had over the multi-generational span?
Well, I was always interested in typography and design as well as illustration. I learned about poster design from my high school teacher, Leon Friend. So and then I always drew. I went to school with Milton Glaser and Ed Sorel. Milton as well was interested in design as well as drawing. And we sort of got together as after we graduated to do freelance work. I thought I'd get a job anyway, which I had to do. But and Ed and I sort of had different jobs, so we got fired from one after the other. And at one point, the three of us decided, okay, let's start a studio. And Ed and I were doing a little promotion piece called the Pushpin Almanac. And we send that out to 3,000 art directors. And it worked. We got work. We got freelance work from it. But otherwise, when we opened the studio, we were starting from scratch and slowly build up clientele. But marketing like that, which included the Pushpin graphic, was very important for us to get work.
But in the days before email and PDFs, how exactly did you distribute to 3,000 art directors?
We had a list.
Yeah?
We printed a list. There was a book with a list of art directors.
Postage or hand delivering?
No, it was put in the mail. I forget how we have to hand address it ourselves. I don't remember how we do that. But we did that.
That sense of marketing, though, was critical.
Yeah. There were other designers who were doing sort of simple promotion pieces like that. So ours was not the first. Pushpin Graphic, though, I think was pretty ambitious for a studio to get involved in. And with the same thing, mailing them out. And it attracted attention because the medium was perfect for us. We designed each issue. Each issue had a theme, and we worked toward that. And all of us, whether it's the three of us or other people who were part of Pushpin at the time, we all contributed our work and continued for about 25 years.
Was it important to you to have a project that you control from beginning to end like that? I don't mean you singularly, but
being able to collaborate was great to be able to do that. But I always had to keep on working anyway, no matter what, so coming up with ideas.
Was that ever that compulsion to work come from family, or just I'd rather be working than not working?
Being able to work proved self-worth.
Yeah. Was that at all, though, something you were raised with in terms of and what did your folks think of you becoming a graphic designer?
Oh, no, my parents encouraged me,
Because it was an actual occupation as opposed to I'm becoming an artist?
A fine artist, though, that's not so good.
That would not have flown?
No.
What was their fields, or what did they do, your parents?
My father was a file clerk, basically, and my mother was a homemaker.
So they respected that you were building something?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Do you use a computer at all for what you do?
Yeah, I do use it for email.
Okay. I mean, for the actual
work?
Any sort of art,
Yeah, the computer becomes part of whatever I do in some form, whether it's helping me color the drawings that I do on paper, or developing art, some art on the computer. But whenever I can, I work on paper first, and then the computer becomes part of what I do.
And you have no tendency of Googling past artwork, not yours, but trying to look at reference material and then losing yourself.
I look at reference material all the time.
Oh, I see all the books behind us, which I'm still just in awe of. I love this apartment, by the way. But yeah, the sense of the thing some artists do is, I just need to look up X, Y, and Z, and then they find it 6 hours later and they're watching cat videos on YouTube. So you're not susceptible to that sort of, losing track and kind of goofing around during the day.
I don't know what you mean.
That's what I figured. Okay. I'm very glad. I now understand how to stay productive for the next 40 years. That's perfect. Okay. I just need to work from there and stop doing all this.
Yeah. Stuff, so. Well, I use Google for picture reference a lot.
But you're able to just say, okay, found it.
Which means that I'm less dependent upon books.
Yeah. Is there a next literary adaptation you're working on?
No.
Okay. I just, I never like, pushing people on what their next project is, but I didn't know if there's another book to look for in terms of, because I have suggestions, but, we could talk about that off mic, just with the classic literature background.
Yeah, there's a lot of book ideas that I have that might go into graphic novels, but I haven't been able to sell any yet.
Oh, okay. Do you have a favorite form in which to work? Do you like doing the books more than posters, or the woodcut versus painting, etc.? Painting.
Well, painting is very difficult, and I don't understand it very, very well. So my paintings have often looked like my illustrations, which I knew is
defeating the
little
purpose.
Point to doing that.
Gotcha. Or the sculpture.
No, I like solving problems. Yeah. Whatever. And it can take any form, whether it's doing a logo or doing a poster.
So when I was on the subway down here, they had a ad right in the middle of the car saying, "Become a graphic designer."
Oh, I saw that.
Oh, good. Okay. With the worst design at all.
Well, it's at 9 months.
Yeah, 9 months part-time, 3 months full-time. Is that all it takes to become a graphic
It might be if you have the talent for it.
How long did it take you? When did you feel you were competent at what you were doing?
Well, that's never happened.
So 3 months or 9 months is out the window.
Yeah, no.
Did you have that experience of seeing your? Do you remember the experience of seeing your work in public the first time, and the sense that there was
not the first time, but when I saw two of my posters in the subway next to each other, that was great.
Yeah,
one for Mobile for the Masterpiece Theater, and another one for Forbes magazine. They were both part of a series that I had done.
Favorite client who no longer exists?
Oh,
so that way you don't have to talk trash about clients who are still around and potentially your clients.
Oh well,
or feel free, just.
Yeah, well, working on a Masterpiece Theater was pretty good. I enjoyed that. Working with clients. Yeah, those who had enough trust in me to give me book jacket assignments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that a form you particularly liked?
Yeah, I like doing book jackets.
Yeah, how has relationship with clients changed, like in terms of their expectations, or is what it was like in the 60s versus now?
I don't know if it's changed. Working for magazines, the system where I do a job for an art director who has to show my concept, my sketch to an editor. There's always a problem if the editor doesn't understand what I had in mind for the work. Mm-hmm. But I think I've done pretty well in spite of that. I mean, I'd rather work with somebody who understands what I'm doing.
Was that more frequent once upon a time, or was there a really good run that you felt like you were in sync with clients and what they needed, or had it been intermittent all throughout?
It changes. I mean, I've worked with different art directors. I've worked on lots of different magazines, and it worked out pretty well with the system.
Mm-hmm. But it takes one change in art director, and
yeah, I've lost work on a series because the art director quit, and the other person was not interested in continuing. Yeah. Like a series I did with Steve Heller called Design and Style. We did sort of fancy brochures for Mohawk paper. And we did about eight of them, these brochures that included fancy things that we could do with paper, showing terrific printing techniques. And the person we worked with sort of left, and then that ended the series.
Is there a project you missed out on, or something you really want to tackle?
There are a couple of book things that I always wanted to do that I may not get a publisher interested in doing it. That's a problem.
But it's more that generated stuff as opposed to an opportunity once upon a time that, I wish I had gotten that job.
No.
Okay.
No. There are a few jobs that I did, rather important ones, where I messed up. That was a problem, where I should have done it differently. I lost out on it. I might have done a sketch, and that was it. So that is a problem. Mm-hmm. But I try to not think about it too often.
Right. I find myself harping endlessly on my failures, which, again, might be why you're more productive by far than I.
Well, what work keeps you from thinking about terrible things like that.
Yeah. Another quote from that collection of yours from about 10 years ago was that your drawing style you felt was preordained at 9 years old or so. Well, it's in print, whether you said it or not. It's attributed to you. So. Is that something you feel?
When I'm 9 years old?
When you were 9, that your drawing style is pretty much, it's pretty much the direction I was going to go.
Yeah, well, I saw Snow White at that time. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't it wasn't drawing.
Yeah. And were there comics?
Comic books, though, I did my own comic books with my own characters because I loved them.
Yeah. Was that a road not traveled for you? Had you thought of going into cartooning? And the money wouldn't have been anywhere near as good as what you do or what you did over the years.
Well, just the circumstances went in a different direction.
I guess that's my greater question. Do you think of things you didn't do, or you pretty much focused on moving forward your entire life? Because that's the vibe I'm getting from you is not a lot of time for retrospection and worrying about what you could have done.
Yeah. Not too much. I mean, I never wanted to do comics that involved drawing with doing superheroes. Mm-hmm. I may have enjoyed reading it, but drawing it was... Yeah. And since I didn't come up for ideas with stories, that you know. My efforts were going to be elsewhere.
And yet the typography and the posters tell a story. You know, I mean, you mentioned not being a writer, but you're still...
Well, I learned type, and then I learned about types of the past when type was decorative, because illustration was sort of non-existent. Typography was used to be expressive much more than it is now. So I got interested in that in art school, in type, and then I used it with design, which seemed to work with what was happening in those times, where we got an interest in styles of Victorian styles and Art Deco and moving up, Art Nouveau.
Did you feel responsible for sort of helping revive that interest?
Well, I did work in it, so I may have had some effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that's the question. Do you see your influence on subsequent generations? And I will note that we're in a house of two typographers. So, your wife's also a renowned typographer and designer. Yeah. So is there a sense that you guys hide logos from each other to keep from...
Hide logos?
Yeah. I don't want her to get my idea. That's
Oh. Well, she says that I influenced her in certain ways, which is fine. And we couldn't work together on anything, but we appreciate each other's work.
Yeah. But that sense of being an influential figure, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, do you see yourself in a sort of pantheon of designers
no,
from the 20th century?
That doesn't interest me.
Yeah.
I avoid it.
Because it would make you static at that point instead of,
Well, I might be envious or jealous of other designers that I know, but otherwise I don't think about my position anywhere,
Unless somebody has ripped you off. Is that
Yeah, they don't do that anymore.
So what does keep you moving forward? Which I know is, again, still asking that key to Seymour Chwast question, but, what is that sense of not wanting to retire, not wanting to stop doing what you do?
Yeah, I like to fill my time with something interesting.
Yeah. And is there a sense of having to resell yourself to clients? Or introduce yourself to younger...
Yeah, well, I know that my reputation affects very little with a client. If the client doesn't like what I do, they won't buy it.
Is there a sense of having to get in the door with people now, or is it still enough of a name recognition? Oh, okay, well, we'll see what Seymour has to say.
Well, there are people who love my work, who I might work with, but we're in the business where it's important for them to be able to make money from what I do. If I can't make enough money for them, they're not going to buy my work.
Which again gets us to art and commerce, which is sort of that intersection for all of these conversations. So.
You're Jewish and left-handed. Wow.
I was going to say, except I have no talent whatsoever. We have a 40-year gap between us, and you've more than lapped me numerous times. But can you talk a little about the sculpture work that you do and how you got into working in a three-dimensional form? And how different that was.
I don't know why I started with paper mache when I was really young, and I just did it in my spare time. Making sort of caricatures. Then I did some paintings. I had a couple of shows with paintings that I'd done in my free time. But then for some reason I got interested in working with sheet metal, and cutting it out and painting them and doing objects. Some of them seemed to be surreal. Some of them were sort of folksy, done in different styles. And I did that for a number of years. And what I loved about that as a medium is that I could bend it. I could make it stand easily if it's something that's going to be on a table, or it can hang on a wall. I can being able to shape it, something you can't do with so many other sculptural media.
And it was just wanting to work in 3 dimensions, just wanting to kind of break out of the picture plane. And do you remember a sense of, just why you'd want to go back into sculpture?
I don't remember how.
Okay.
For woodcutting, though, I know the reason why I do it is that it's somewhat physical in having to cut out shapes. Yeah. And I like that. Working with a block, it's different than working with a pen on paper. Mm-hmm. There's more effort involved in sort of becoming more part of the work.
And the risk of gouging a fingernail or something. That's
some danger.
To me, it would just look terrible. It's why when I went into doing business magazines in the 90s, we had to do the layouts ourselves, even though I was editorial. Mm-hmm. And I was very happy because when I entered the space, they had quark, so you could actually lay stuff out on a screen. Because if I was doing physical, cut up and pasting, it would have looked like a magazine made by a serial killer. I mean, it just would have been terrible. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad I entered the space at a time when, the human touch was removed.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of artists I talked to, and in fact, the time you and I met, you attended a live show that I did with Ben Catcher a few years ago at the New School, mm-hmm. I think. And there was a lot of surprise when Ben mentioned that he'd been doing solely digital comics, just drawing on a tablet for years. Yeah. Half the room was surprised. The other half said, "Oh no, you can tell because his line changed when he mm-hmm. started doing this." That's never been a temptation as far as you're concerned. Trying to
work on a tablet, never.
Yeah, it's always been that physical
paper,
touch.
Yeah, paper
or wood. So
yeah, the tension between the pen and the paper is very important to me.
Yeah, besides Ben, are there other, I'd say, cartoonists you either follow or have some appreciation of, without fear of, making the rest of them feel bad that we don't mention them?
Well, then I won't name any.
But do you read comics at all, or graphic novels? Are you?
Rarely. No, I was surprised how well some of them have done, and some have been made into movies. There's one movie that I love called Ghost World.
Oh yeah, Dan Klaus's.
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
I was happy that, and I got some pride out of thinking it started out as a graphic novel.
Yeah. And as last question, what are you doing next?
Well, right now I'm working on a book about hell, all the different hells in the world in history, and finding the similarities and the differences in them and in the way people are treated after they die. Mm-hmm. So I'm working. I'm doing drawings for it, although I don't have a publisher yet. And I'm working with Steve Heller on it. Because he can help me put some words to this.
Is that a preoccupation with mortality thing, or just a subject you wanted to tackle?
No, just an idea.
Once again, you don't seem to have that level of neurosis that characterizes our people. So I'm proud of you. That's good. And when you did the adaptation of the Divine Comedy, had you read it before launching into the project?
No.
Or okay, So that was your first exposure to that hell a couple of years ago?
Well, I'd seen his chart.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Of that fascinated me. And also sort of doing that book, I gained interest in doing other hells beside that particular Christian one.
I guess it's sort of a meta question. Do you see things in terms of engineering problems or of problems that, need to be fixed? Do you look outside and see somebody's signage and say, oh, that's actually terrible,
signage on the street?
Yeah.
Of course.
And then does that extend to other aspects of design in the world, or is it really, constrained to the areas that you work in?
I was very happy when they got new stands for paying the meters for cars.
Yeah.
And they had to do something. Well, I remember there used to be a meter for each car. But they had in New York, there were some really terribly designed ones. And they fixed it. They got some new ones that were just little monoliths, very compact. And I was very happy about that.
If there was one thing you could design for New York City, what would it be? Sort of like the Vignelli, subway map or something.
Oh, yeah.
Is there one thing that you, I would fix this one thing about New York?
Yeah, subway maps are important. What would I... Yeah, I think they ought to make a terrific looking stand on the street to hold all the free newspapers and magazines. Because now they're just some crummy ones that fall apart all the time and make a mess.
Stickers slapped on them, and
yeah, it just is a mess. And in some places, especially out of New York, they know how to handle that.
That's a good enough point to leave off on.
Oh, good.
Seymour,
okay.
Thanks for joining the show.
Okay.
And that was Seymour Chwast. He's got two websites, Seymour Chwast Archive, which is SeymourChwast archive.com, and Pushpin Inc., which is PushPinInc.com. First one's got an amazing collection of his work and links to his books and posters and more, but check both of them out because Seymour and Pushpin have been just immensely influential over the decades. I don't even know where to tell you to start, given the multiple monographs, the literary adaptations, the other collected works, the sculptures, and all the other art that he makes. He's also on Twitter and Instagram as Seymour Chwast. And again, Chwast is Chwast. But whatever your point of entry for this guy, you're going to get overwhelmed by the scope of his work. And I hope you'll find it somewhat inspiring. Our next guest is Ann Rivera, who was the very first guest I ever recorded with back in 2012. I have known Ann since our college days at Hampshire in the early 90s. This time around, she was on her way back home to Buffalo from the MLA conference in New York, and she dropped in just to catch up. I talked about that last week, about how nice it is just to have a friend who does that. Anyway, after plying her with a strawberry rhubarb pie from Auntie Elle's Bakery, I broke out the mics and we recorded the following segment. Here's her little bio from the last time she was on in 2013. Ann Rivera is an assistant professor of English at Villa Maria College in Buffalo, New York. She attended Hampshire College with your humble podcast host in the early 90s, which may help explain our mutual wariness of postmodernism. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Ann Rivera. So you're coming from MLA.
Yes.
What sort of panels? What did you get out of the the event? I know it's not you weren't there for the full shebang. I guess you're leaving a day or two early.
I'm leaving 2 days early, but I came for Thursday, which was an interesting day since, the bomb cyclone happened. I can't even say it properly because it's just such a strange thing. I had gone because I wanted to go to Advocating for Your Department. It's a workshop to talk to English professors about why and how you should work with your program. And it's in response to the theme this year, which is called States of Insecurity. And the reason why it's the theme, of course, is because the current political climate. We had the head of the ACLU speak as part of the plenary speakers. But it's also because the humanities are under attack. And the humanities are under attack in a lot of ways. You read the headlines about English departments being dismantled. You read maybe the headlines in the trade magazines talking about enrollments declining, and it's usually framed as this competition, this pressure under STEM fields. The arts are declining in general, but English in particular, with the exception of service courses. Service courses are like composition that people have to take. At the same time, you're seeing this decline in appointing tenured professors or tenure track professors, or for that matter, professors like myself who have the assistant professor title in an institution that has no tenure at all. We're contract personnel, so they can terminate us up to the middle of the semester if our enrollments aren't up. It creates an interesting climate. It also creates a certain amount of hysteria around enrollments. But underlying it, and the thing that most of the panels that I went to after this workshop started to circle around, maybe not talk directly about, but circle around this underlying question of, are the humanities really useful? How are they useful? Why is it that the incoming population of students, which in general are declining and we're all competing for, why are they not embracing the humanities? And one of the big stories circulating around the conference was about the Yale History Department. The Yale History Department undertook this entire retooling. It was declining in terms of enrollment. Students weren't interested. The biggest major in Yale up to I think last year was economics. Now this year, history is number one. And the question is, why? And the argument that the Yale History Department made for this is that what they had been doing didn't meet the needs and the desires of the students coming in. And so they did a lot of surveys, they did a lot of questioning, they did a lot of self-questioning, and they came up with a major that had two tracks to it. One that was a traditional track to go into academia, and one was for people who wanted to serve as public intellectuals, people who wanted to speak to the public about the humanities, but also illustrate how the humanities can engage and empower constituencies. And most of what happened, or where we ended up in a lot of these panels, no matter the topics, I went to one on combining writing studies with traditional English departments. I went to another about finding funding in the humanities. I went to another about the role of the anthology in today. And it all came back to this point. Why is it that we feel under attack? Why are we in a state of insecurity, and what do we do about it? What came out for me, in part because I listened to Kathy Davidson speak as one of the plenary speakers. She is one of my absolute heroes in academia. When I said I was going to go see her, when I was talking to my dean about this, I got all stuttery. It's a big English nerd moment. It was great. But one of the things, she has a new book out about higher education. I believe it's called The New Education, but you should check me on the title. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that she's talking about here is, how do you engage your constituency? How do you think about engaging with and empowering a particular community in a classroom? And what does that have to do with democracy at large? Because one of the things that Kathy Davidson is very big on is this idea of the public intellectual. And the public intellectual is different than the private intellectual. The public intellectual is the one who has a grasp of the issues, has the context, has the history, has the literary history, but also uses these tools in order to engage with communities. And engaging with communities is different than speaking to communities. Speaking to communities is the situation where you get the professor at the front of the classroom who lectures to the students and says, you need to read this because it's good for you, in this kind of circular logic or circular reasoning that goes on. So it would be for me, who often teaches Puritans. I'm usually
as a subject, not as the students.
Yeah, no, the students. Not my students. My students are usually budding radicals, so I'm pretty good with that. No, most of them are about as far as Puritans that you can get, but usually people don't teach the Puritans very much, don't even know the Puritans, the people with the buckles and the funny hats. It would be like if I stood in front and said, you need to read John Winthrop, City on a Hill, as a part of his larger sermon on the Arabella. You need to read him because it's good for you. And there's a circular logic in here. And I think one of the things that the humanities hasn't been very good at is all these years we've been talking to each other. I can sit here and say to another 18th century Americanist, John Winthrop and his Shining City on the Hill speech, and immediately everybody in the room who has dealt with these issues knows what I'm talking about. But knowing about Winthrop is useful for people who aren't necessarily part of that constituency or that community, that intellectual community, that particular academic bent, because you can be intellectual in a variety of ways. Instead, when I taught this, I had students who are social activists. They're interested in organizing, and they found Winthrop really interesting because of his emphasis on the communal and the way that he invoked it throughout. Is that the main thrust of how I would say write about it in a literary journal? No, because that's not really how I look at Winthrop. Was it useful to my student? Absolutely. And that's where it's that bridge that I think the humanities, we've been a little self-indulgent. We haven't been so good about explaining how these things can still be relevant to students' lives. And so from MLA, that's a big thing that I took away from it, is that in part we're in a state of insecurity because we've forgotten our public function. And we've forgotten that a big part of the public function is to serve. And to serve the people that we're working with, not speaking to necessarily. Does that mean that we abandon rigor, though? Because that's usually where this comes into this conversation. I would say no. I think, unfortunately, rigor is often used as a cover for just reinforcing this kind of structural inequality that comes with academia. In other words, there are people who get it and there are people who don't. And in fact, it's still rampant. I sat in a panel where a guy was presenting to us. And he said, look, we can all understand this here. I'm pretty sure we all have 3-digit IQs. And everybody went, it's so funny. And I thought, wow, that was super offensive. Really? Nobody else can understand this? What if I don't have a 3-digit IQ? Am I somehow not a professor? I'm nitpicking a little bit here, but a lot of times it's that kind of knee-jerk elitism that cuts us off, that we end up having problems with. You can do rigor. You can do rigor without elitism. It's hard. It's a balancing act. It is one of those things where you can hear what people need, and you need to persuade them about why they still need to read some of these other things. So we don't sacrifice content. You have to find that bridge, that meeting place.
Is there a degree of understanding, I suppose, who is the quote unquote customer, either the student or the person paying the student's bills, in this case, the parent? Yeah. Or is it an instance where the idea of customer is something that creates a completely different framework than what academic studies should be about?
Both.
Okay. I'm glad we got that answered.
So what happens here is that part of this is the side effect, I think, of the universal push for higher education that everybody needs to go to college. It never fails to surprise people. I'm not an advocate of it. I think college should be accessible. I think we need to reduce barriers to access. I myself have a child who's not really interested in college, and I have no problem with that. Mm-hmm. College will always be there. He can choose or he cannot choose, but I'm not going to push him to be there. And I don't have a great percentage of it, but I would say A fair number of freshmen that I teach every single year got pushed into it. They don't know why they're there. They don't know what they're doing, and they're spending money doing it. And primarily they're spending money they don't have and can't afford. And I have a smaller proportion, but they're still there, a subset of that group who don't want to be there at all and are being compelled to go.
Right.
That shouldn't happen. I think because we've pushed so many people into higher education, we're not real clear what higher education is supposed to do. And we have become prey to this consumer model of education, which is that it's a business. You're supposed to have this specific product at the end. You're supposed to be employed the second you graduate. That's fairly problematic specifically for the humanities, because while majors in the humanities are not only employed at the same rate as engineers if you give them a few years, but they have longer longevity, and on top of it, their salaries tend to catch up. Little known fact, but it's there. If you look at a lot of the think tanks in the AAC and you have actually tracked this, it is true. But what that gap in the beginning can be a problem. It's not an immediate product, and so it's harder to explain and it's harder to understand. At the same time, there is this trend, there was this trend where the humanities felt like they didn't have to explain it, that people could just work it out whatever way they wanted to work out, and students needed some more directions about finding what kind of career they're interested in, applying the humanities skills. We need to be overt about the skills that the field gives you. That's the piece that I think people working in the humanities have been lax.
Within the space, is there an inflection point that you guys all saw, or in retrospect, looking back, and that was the point at which we kind of lost our way, or that's the point at which the divergence between the humanities and what it actually prepares you for became clear?
Not yet. We're still questioning ourselves. The events of the last year and a half have thrown these things into high relief. They've always been simmering.
That's what I want, because we know it's been going on for years.
Oh, yeah.
But, was there a point of that was really at the moment where we kind of, or where the recession or whatever it was led to, people leaving the humanities in droves, I suppose, or just not pursuing them.
Honestly,
initially.
It did start in the Clintonian years.
Mm-hmm.
You have that neoliberalist agenda that overtly says that they support education and covertly defunds it. And that's a problem. So that creates a certain set of pressures in terms of, I think there's a couple inflection points now that I'm thinking about it. So defunding, while saying that you support it and pushing more students to it, causes a certain set of pressures in terms of outcomes. Then on top of it, you have the No Child Left Behind, this concept that data drives education. And then, so now you're in this place where you have big data, you have this twin pressures of everyone should go to school, so it should be accessible to everyone. But at the same time, we're going to defund it so that the realities of what it means to make education accessible to everyone is not supported. And there's that outcomes that then gets tied to big data, because people assume that if you deal with data, that therefore there's immediate outcomes. A lot of my job in the last 2 years has been outcomes assessment. Mm-hmm. How do we assess that people have actually learned what you say they're learning in the humanities? This too becomes this kind of covert attack on the humanities. I was arguing, I guess for the last year, with, well, not so much arguing, but having to clarify over and over again to our assessment director, who didn't have a good sense of the humanities, that exposure is an important first step to learning. In other words, you can read something the first time and you can get something out of it that may not be immediately measurable. And the way that I look at this is I look at my own kids, both of whom have struggled with reading in various ways. But I'll take my son as the biggest example. He has dyslexia. He has some comprehension problems. And he would read books way above his reading level. He'd skip lines. He wouldn't get a lot of it. And his teachers kept telling me, don't give him those books. Give him these books. And the books that they would suggest were below grade level, below his age level, and frankly bored him. My daughter suffered from a similar situation. Not quite as severe, but again, she wanted the plots that were available to what they termed the higher functioning readers, which in and of itself is a disturbing term. But she was given, because she was still struggling with some of the text and some of the fluency in reading coherently in the text, she was given these really baseline readers. And as a result, it kept denaturing reading for both kids. And without really being cognizant of why, I just kept giving them the other books. Oh, you like Harry Potter? Here. Can you read all the way through it? Nope. But what's interesting to me with my son, which is why I started with him, because he's 18 now, he has all this context knowledge that he picked up from these books that none of us really understood he was getting. It wasn't measurable. It wasn't measurable in terms of grades. It wasn't recognizable to his teachers, but now he's using it. So he has an English tutor working with him for his English Regents to pass it. He has an English teacher. He's in a special education classroom, but they're doing things like reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he has a lot of interesting things to say about this, because I think, in part, we let him read these books, even if he maybe didn't read it to the mark that he was supposed to. That's where assessment becomes difficult in the humanities, I think. And that's where I come back to this idea that radical pedagogy really embraces, which is that you have to work with who's doing the reading. You have to work with the group and what they want. You know, offer it to them, you show them the rigor, you show them the tools, how to read, how to do a good literary analysis, how to understand how texts are put together, but they might get different meaning and different use from it. And I think we need to let go enough to admit that that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
And you can bring all that back from MLA too? Or you're going to be able to say back on at your college that, look, they say it down here too. It's okay.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I'm engaged in all of that right now.
And who have you been reading?
Well, this is an interesting question, because one of the things that I'm finishing up is Pete Bagg's Fire, which is his graphic novel about Zora Neale Hurston. I'm a huge fan of Zora Neale Hurston, so it was a birthday gift.
And Pete Bagg.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
The Hate series, absolutely.
I've got my signed copies over on the other side of the library.
And this is why we're no longer friends.
I didn't even tell you, Pete and I became show buddies at the Columbus Cartooning Festival, because I was supposed to record with him. And I walked over to say hello. We'd recorded a few years before, and we just started shooting the breeze, and it turned into this. I was the adult guy in a decent suit and not gushing or fanboyish. And we just sort of hit it off and hung out all evening, and then decided to record a live episode with an audience the next day for his panel instead of my recording with him solo in the room. But
ooh, that's fun. And
then we hung out the next day at the on the floor, the exhibit hall, I guess, where the cartoonists were all selling, because he was sitting by himself and seemed bored. There was a second chair, so I just sat down and we started shooting the breeze. And the big challenge from there was a customer came up and wanted to commission a drawing of a baseball player. Just a baseball player, Pete, you pick who it is. And they're just spitballing and brainstorming, trying to figure out who, before settling on Randy Johnson. That look. So from there on, Pete and I were just going back and forth as to what a Pete Bagg drawing of Randy Johnson should look like. He ended up coming up with it that night and emailed it over to me the next day. But so that you can hate me even further.
I do.
Because the week before that, I was hanging out with Beto Hernandez under the same circumstance. So
you're hurting me. You're actually literally hurting me right now.
All your favorite cartoonists are my pals.
Okay, fine.
So Zora Neale Hurston and the Fire.
So I'm reading this book, and I finished it last night after I came back from MLA, and I realized that this book is an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's a graphic novel. It's well researched. It's got a strong narrative structure to it. It's got excellent dialogue. And of course, I know some of this is because Hurston herself is fabulously interesting all the way through. So he picked a great subject. But the thing that really struck me, just as an academic who's read a fair number of Hurston, a bunch of treatments about her, is that after every page, really, that depicts a scene in her life, he has the research and explains what's going on.
Yeah.
So it's clear he did all of that work. He even tackled that thorny issue that's always surrounding Hurston, which is the use of dialect. Her use of dialect in her novels, but also he reproduces it. And he's very clear about why he did it, why that's in concordance with what Hurston believed. He tackled her complexities, her inherent contradictions, the struggles that she had in terms of working as an anthropologist. He caught a beautiful scene between her and Boaz about measuring people's heads in Harlem. All of this is true. All of it is stuff that's happened. But so much craft went into it. Artistic craft, narrative craft, storytelling craft, but also those critical tools, those things that always get harped on again and again and again about higher education. Critical thinking, research, transmitting knowledge. It's all of those things. And he does it in this visual text. And he does it in a way that makes Hurston accessible and interesting to a wider variety of people. That's part of the work that I see public intellectuals doing, is thinking in terms of doing the work, doing that deep reading and presenting it, using the craft to create something that really interests people. Because I will bet that the more that text circulates around, the more people will be interested in Hurston, will start reading a wider variety of her work, maybe reading the biographies, maybe reading the anthropology work that she has. I don't see what's bad about that. I think that is really where we need to go. And if we're going to talk about the humanities being relevant, this is how we become relevant again. This is how we talk about these things, because it is representing engagement and having people be engaged at various levels. Is it a scholarly tome? No. Does he talk about intersectional identities and white hegemony? No. Does he depict it? Absolutely.
Yeah, it's because he's not explicitly, but it touches everything that's in there.
He does talk about it, though, in the footnote. Yeah, and he does it very, very well. And what's nice about that, it allows you to engage with the text at various levels. You can read all the way through, and you can see it and not read the notes. You can read each panel and read the notes. There are multiple places that you can access this text. And I think that's the way that we need to think about the humanities and about what public intellectuals need to do. It's about multiple areas of access, expanding it out, allowing people to engage with it more. Because I do believe, I have a very old-fashioned ideal about the humanities. I see that books have enriched my life. Books have enriched my son's life. Books have enriched my daughter's life. Books have enriched my students' lives in a variety of ways that I could not predict. I don't know always why some texts catch students in ways and others don't, with the exception of Octavia Butler's Kindred, which literally everybody loves.
Always gets...
Always, without fail. I've taught it several years in a row, and everybody's into that book. It's amazing. But some of the other things that I teach, even like I just got done teaching a fantasy course, and I taught the first of the Earthsea books by Le Guin. I taught Uprooted by Naomi Novik, and I taught Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman. And of those three texts, a different set of students engaged differently with it. Now, to get back to the consumer model, one of the fears here is that in this consumer model, in this engaging, representing, being in dialogue with, and being influenced by your constituency, which I'm using that really overtly and with a lot of choice, simply because I think that's different than consumer. Mm-hmm. The consumer is always right. That's not what I'm talking about. I had students who hated the Earthsea book, hated A Wizard of Earthsea. But it was good that they read it because it informed how they read the next one. And so it made connections for them in surprising ways. I made them do it. I took them through it. But I also, this semester, had this interesting place where, for the first time, I had people actively resisting doing annotations. So see, the thing that I make students do is I make them annotate their texts. I allow them to do marginalia in a variety of ways. Since I have students who rent texts, I have a lot of financially insecure students. And so requiring all of them to buy the books would then mean that they stop out of the class. And I don't want that to happen. So I have all of these different ways that you can annotate your work. I would prefer you to write in the book if you can, but you could digitally annotate something if you must. You could do what I set up as 2 or 3 column notes to teach them how to annotate. And I had a variety of students this time who hated annotating because they were fans of fantasy and it broke the frame of their reading.
The flow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It didn't want to stop it. So for a subset of those, I was able to kind of work around it and say, okay, so read the chapter once and then go back and annotate. And they were fine. I had another subset that refused. So they wrote me an essay at the end of every week about their responses. That's what we're talking about when we talk about working with the constituency. Do they still have to do the work? Absolutely. Do they still have to take it apart? And I had a few who hated annotations because basically they didn't want to do any critical analysis. Tough. You still have to do critical analysis, but you should be allowed to engage with it in a variety of ways. And I sat down with that subset of students, who, by the way, were mostly honor students, and explained to them why I wanted them to do it. Because the other thing that happens in the humanities that's not engaging, that's the talking to piece, is that we feel like we don't have to explain ourselves. You will annotate because it's good for you. No, I need to explain myself. I'll still make you do it, but I need to explain it. And that way you get these multiple areas of access, you get more engagement, and even though it seems like a leap, that's what Bag's doing with his text as well.
Anything else besides Bag?
Yes, several things, many things.
Okay.
You're getting me off of Christmas break. I read for fun. So I just finished The Good Lord Bird by James Mcbride, which is excellent. When I first started reading it, I will admit, I was like, oh, this is just like Mark Twain. Except it's not. It's, so have you read it?
No.
Okay, so it's a narrative about a boy named Onion. Well, he gets named Onion. Basically, it is a fictional narrative around John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. Mm-hmm. So it's really, 19th century Americanist. I'm very into this. But what's really interesting about it is it reads like a farce pretty much all the way through. The boy gets deemed a girl by John Brown, puts him in a dress. He's enslaved in Kansas. That's where they meet. I should back up. I'm not telling this very well. So we'll start at the beginning. So the beginning is the boy is enslaved by a man named Dutch Henry in Kansas during the bloody Kansas years. So where you're having people fighting back and forth about abolitionism. And all of a sudden, old John Brown, that's how he's termed in the text pretty much all the way through, old John Brown comes in for a haircut. He gets a haircut by the boy's father, and then suddenly Dutch figures out who he is. There's some arguing that goes back and forth. Words are exchanged, guns are drawn, and shooting happens. The boy's father is killed. And John Brown says, I will liberate you from slavery, young lady. And he does. He brings him out into the wilderness, puts him in a dress and a bonnet because he looks so feminine, and then renames him Onion after John Brown's lucky charm that he takes out of the pocket and hands to the boy, now girl. And the boy thinks, I'm supposed to eat it. And so he bites into it and swallows it. John Brown's lucky charm. And he gets named Onion and gets dubbed by John Brown, you are my lucky charm from now on. And the kid at first goes along with it because it seems like the safer bet. And also because he says himself, I'm a lazy person. I don't have to do a lot of work over here. But then, of course, he does because he's a girl, according to these people. And so he has to carry water and he has to cook, he has to fix plates. And he also finds old John Brown fascinating because Brown, according to Mcbride, is a man of faith. And he's always praying for a long time. But it's told in a satirical manner. In other words, he rabbits on. He rattles on no matter what's going on around him. It doesn't matter if people are hungry. It's about the good Lord speaking to him. Finally, they start engaging with the roving bands of pro-slavery activists, federal troops out in the wilderness in Kansas. It's based on historical events, but expanded. Throughout the whole book, there's this back and forth that happens between Onion and John Brown, where Onion leaves and escapes the camp and then comes back to it. And he basically rides on and off with Brown and his family until the Harper's Ferry raid and what happens there. What's interesting to me about the book, in a lot of ways, is it plays with these ideas of projection and minstrelsy. So what happens with Brown is depicted in a very complicated way. He is the pinnacle of white folk because he sees what he wants to see, right down to Onion's gender. Basically decrees, you're a girl. It doesn't really matter what you are, you're a girl. I think you're a girl, so therefore you're a girl, which says something, right, about how white folks see black folk. And it also, at the same time, Brown is a sympathetic character because he really believes in what he's doing. And he's willing to put his family and his life on the line. And so he's dedicated. But there's lampooning of all the people involved in abolitionism all the way through. There's a scene with Frederick Douglass that is so hysterical and so irreverent. I can't possibly capture it here, but it's hysterically funny. Yeah. It has a lot to do with this issue of intersectionality, about what it means to be of color, what it means to be, at least, be gendered, but not gendered at the same time. Yeah. And it also says a lot about the fragmentation of early America and what can happen in those interstices. So it's an interesting read. I really liked it. Good narrative. I say go read that book. Even if you don't know anything about abolitionists, you can totally be a part of it. It's funny, too.
Cool. Is there any book that you don't teach that you come back to every year or relatively often?
That is an interesting question. I do not teach romance fiction, but there is a paranormal romance that I come back to every Halloween called Wild Ride by Jennifer Cruzi. It takes place in Ohio, in Columbus, as a matter of fact. Well, near it anyway. It takes place in Ohio, and it is in an amusement park that turns out to be a demon keep. And the statues, the iron statues in it, are demon prisons. And they stage a revolt at Halloween.
What brings you back to that one?
The characterization brings me back to it. The sheer audacity of having a paranormal romance take place in Ohio is fantastic. And the craft of it really interests me because it's co-written by Jennifer Cruzi and Bob Mayer. And they did this thing where they divided up chapters that she wrote in the female protagonist's voice and he wrote in the male protagonist's voice. And I don't want to entirely ruin it, but they have a connection that they don't see immediately at the start.
See, I was disappointed because I was going to ask if there was boy writing and girl writing based on the collaboration.
Yes,
you've already answered that.
There is. Yes, there is. And it's interesting for me as somebody who teaches writing to see where it blends and where it doesn't, maybe. And so I come back to it. It's atmospheric. It's a good Halloween novel. There's lots of ghosts. There's demons. There's possession. There's people running around. There's really amazing ice cream and waffles, which I have replicated mostly. It's really good stuff. So I never teach it, although I have thought about teaching the romance genre and using Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, where she does kind of a sociological study of romance readers, although she works primarily with Harlequin folk. And I'm curious to do this with students because I teach a lot of creative writing students, thinking about the romance and asking the question, is it possible to have a feminist romance novel? Because Jennifer Cruzi gets close. She has asked that question in a couple places. And it's an interesting question to ask.
We will save that for your fourth appearance on the show. Ann Rivera, thanks so much for coming back on.
It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And safe drive up to Buffalo.
Thank you.
And that was Ann Rivera. No website for Ann, but if you have a message for her, send it my way and I'll forward it. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including the quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, and my new secret project, which I hope to tell you guys about later this month, which will keep it from being secret. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded the segment with Seymour at his home in New York City, so that was $10 at the GW, $6 for subway fare, $30 for parking, another $5 or so for coffee. The segment with Ann was at my house, so it was just $12 for the strawberry rhubarb pie. Now, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, and pie, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, and Michael Janizik for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with, I hope, a conversation with John Leland, author of the new book, Happiness is a Choice You Make. I hope, because we haven't recorded it yet. If it doesn't happen for some reason, then you'll hear my conversation with science fiction author Levi Tadar, recorded last October in London. You'll have to come back to find out. Till then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for us. That'll help build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.